We're the flagship program in this state, right? And
a bullshit, a bullshit, a bullshit, a bullshit.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. My name is Michael Wein. Co-hosting is Mr. Nixon. Welcome back to another edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports, Friday, August 2nd, 11 p.m. Eastern Time. I am on the East Coast in Boone, North Carolina, live streaming from the mountains. Emmy, of course, back in Austin, Texas, where the Texas Longhorns have opened up 2024 fall camp on Wednesday. We are going to talk about that. Today is our offensive line preview, and if we get time at the end, we'll jump into some more Big Ten discussion to finish off our team previews in the Big Ten. Mr. Emmy Nixon, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well, man. I've been watching a lot of Texas content over the last couple of days about first couple of days of practice. I've been hearing a lot of good things about the wide receiver room, the secondary, et cetera. We'll get into it tonight, but yeah, I'm excited to get into this. It's been a while since we've done one of these episodes.
Tomorrow, which will be August 3rd, will mark 4 weeks until Texas's opening game at Darrell K. Royal Stadium against Colorado State. That's certainly exciting, and it will mark 3 weeks until week 0 of the college football season. So I know everyone it kind of creeps up on you, that week 0 week of kind of like 10 games-ish. But the week after that, Texas will open their season, but they have open fall camp. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. So I'll just open it up to you, Emmy. Based on the things that you've heard over the past couple days since practice opened on Wednesday, I don't think the team practiced today, but I know they practiced Wednesday and yesterday. Where does your mind go? Where do you want to start this discussion?
For me, my mind goes straight to Silas Bolden, the transfer that we brought in. He, from what I've heard, has won over the punt return job, and right now, he's going to eat into some of those top 3 that we talk about a lot: Cook, Bond, and Golden. He's going to eat into those guys' playing time, and that's a good thing. I think he's going to be more than just maybe what we thought originally. He's going to be used in just about everything in the route tree, I think. And I think maybe I underrated just how good his suddenness is with the ball in his hands.
I think the receivers are going to be a big discussion all season long. The rotation, how is Sark going to play that? because usually Sark keeps a very tight rotation in the wide receiver room, the guys he really trusts. I don't know that Texas, and hopefully someone may prove us wrong, right? Isaiah Bond could go out and have a huge season and be a first-round draft pick. Silas Bolden could elevate his stock as he's out of eligibility after this year. A lot of these guys could eventually become high draft picks. I think Matthew Golden, if you wanted to, could come back. Isaiah Bond could come back, but the expectation is he's going to leave early for the draft. And then you have all these younger guys that you're trying to develop. From what I've heard, based on how it was conveyed to me in the first couple days of practice, the starting wide receivers, and take this with a grain of salt because a lot can change over the next 3 or 4 weeks. Texas will have the next, I think, 3 weeks of practice, and then they'll get into game week prep the week before their first game. They'll install their game plans. Jonte Cook was working with the ones, as I kind of expected. On the other side of the field was Isaiah Bond. And then DeAndre Moore, just like in the spring, was working out of the slot. Those were the 3 starting wide receivers. No real surprise to me. DeAndre Moore's a guy who's been in the program for a year, started in the slot in the spring, and they're probably just trying to give him more reps there to start out fall camp. The second team wide receivers, though, were interesting. You had Silas Bolden working on the side of the field, rotating in and out with Isaiah Bond. You had Ryan Wingo working on the other side of the field, battling with Jonte Cook. And look, Wingo's a guy I think is going to get a good majority of the snaps this year. I think he's in play for probably 30 to 40% of snaps based on how good I think that guy is. And then the new development, which we did not see in the spring, was Matthew Golden working out of the slot behind DeAndre Moore. Those are the 6 main guys. And then you have some younger freshmen, Parker Livingstone, Aaron Butler, working with the third team. Those 2 are freshman wide receivers in this class with Ryan Wingo. And then Ryan Niblett, who was in the class with Jonte Cook and DeAndre Moore, was working in the slot with the third team. It should be interesting to see how all of that plays out. But for me, I'm actually going to take us to the defense because I really fast want to run through. Well, first of all, do you have anything else you want to say on the wide receivers before I move to the defensive side of the football?
No, I think that's it on the wide receivers.
Okay. We're going to dive deeper into the wide receiver room before the season starts. But for now, let's leave that there. Here's how the defensive depth chart lines up right now at the start of fall camp. And you can jump in with any of your takeaways. Feel free to just jump in with any of your thoughts. How it started out in team drills. First team, strong side defensive end was Baron Sorrell. Not a surprise to me. Your starting nose tackle and your starting defensive tackle were Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton. Not a surprise to us, I don't think, at least to start. And then kind of a surprise to me was that Trey Moore immediately was getting first team reps at the weak side defensive end or pass rusher, edge, whatever you want to call it. Your starting linebackers were Anthony Hill and David Binda. Not a surprise, I don't think. The surprise for me, actually 2 surprises. You had Manny Muhammad starting at one field corner. Then you had Gavin Holmes who played a lot behind goodness.
Watts,
Yes.
right?
Ryan
Ryan Watts.
Watts at the other corner. And you had Jalen Gilbo working at the nickel position. So no Jade Barron on first team. We'll get to that here in a little bit. And then your starting safeties were Michael Taff, who, congratulations to him, he along with Isaiah Bond are going to be this year's Lamborghini partners. So those two guys have the Lamborghini NIL deals for this year. You had Michael Taff and Derek Williams, the second-year safety, working at the safety positions. On the second team, you had Ethan Burke working behind Baron Sorrell at the strong side defensive end. You had Aaron Bryant and Tia Savea working on the defensive line, Tia Savea being one of the defensive line transfers from Arizona. And Justice Finkley actually working with the second team weak side edge position ahead of Colin Simmons. And then you had Leona Lefau and Maurice Blackwell working as second team linebackers. And then here's where it gets even more interesting. No Jade Barron in the second team secondary. You had Andrew Makuba and Xavier Filsamy, the 5-star freshman, working at the safety positions. And you had Kobe Black, who's a freshman, corner. Warren Roberson, who's also, I think he's a sophomore. And Jelani McDonald working at the nickel. And then you had Jade Barron working with the third team at nickel.
Wow.
So where this conversation, I think, needs to be focused is where does Jade Barron fit into this defensive equation? Because I think one of the reasons Jade Barron came back to school for his fifth and final season at Texas, when he could have easily gone to the draft and probably been, I don't know, an early day 3 kind of pick, is I think Texas wants to try to get him, from what I'm hearing, playing some outside corner so that he can supposedly elevate his draft stock as high as he can, show his versatility. And when they did their wide receiver defensive back one-on-ones, you had Jade Barron working first. He was first out there working against, Ryan Wingo and Isaiah Bond at corner. So I think that dynamic, what Jade Barron's role in 2024 is going to be really interesting, because I think Texas wants to get their best 5 defensive backs on the field at all times. It doesn't matter what positions. They just need their best 5 athletes out there, whoever those guys are. And I think the one spot in the secondary right now that's really kind of a position battle is Andrew Makuba battling with Michael Taff for that other safety position across from Derek Williams, who's basically a shoo-in starter.
Yeah, 5-star.
I think at the end of the day, though, while it might seem like that's kind of a position battle, I think that's going to be more of a situational thing. You'll have Makuba in there for certain situations, and you'll have Taff in there for certain situations. What is your thoughts based on all of that on the secondary as of right now?
Well, hearing that Jade Barron is third team, I'm just now hearing this, by the way. I didn't hear about that from what I had been watching. My initial reaction to that is that, wow, like we must be really deep right now, which I kind of already knew, but I guess that just kind of confirms it in my head. The fact that you're putting Black, who is a true freshman, second string, over a 5th-year senior. I mean, even though it's August second right now. It's super early. We're literally 2 days into this thing. But regardless, I think just the principle of that, just having the trust in him to be put at second string above a guy like Jahdae Barron, who's been here, done it for years. I think that matters a lot. And I honestly think it's a good thing because it just shows how deep we are in the secondary.
Absolutely. I think we saw this some in the spring. I think Texas, whether it's Pete Kwiatkowski or any of these defensive coaches, Blake Gideon, think that it's time for Jalen Gilbo to take over at the nickel and to see what Jahdae Barron can offer you at outside corner. Because we think Manny Muhammad is going to be a really good player. I mean, the media thinks he's going to be second team all SEC based on the way that they voted at media days, the preseason all SEC teams. I am a little hesitant to go that far right now. I mean, we've seen Manny Muhammad play well in the time he's been given, but the SEC's got a lot of good athletes that are, just as athletic and highly touted and recruited as Manny Muhammad is. I hope that he ends up being that good. But regardless, the real question is the other corner position, which was previously occupied by, Terrence Brooks and Ryan Watts. Who replaces that production? Could it be Javion Cole, who was working with the 13 to start out, the transfer from San Jose State, who we'll talk more about when we do our secondary deep dive? Will it be Gavin Holmes? Or could Jahdae Barron jump into that equation so Texas can have their 5 best covermen on the field at all times? It'll be interesting to see how that works out. And then that safety battle, as I mentioned, it's Michael Tapp and Andrew Makuba battling for playing time, with Derek Williams being the shoo-in. And then the only other thing that really surprised me was Colin Simmons working third team. I think eventually, as time goes on, he will get to second team, weak side edge rusher, and possibly even work his way in some with the ones as fall camp goes on. So I wouldn't put too much stock into that. What we were hearing in the spring was he's kind of like Anthony Hill. Anthony Hill last year, until the very end of the season, where he really came on, especially in the Oklahoma State game, where he
was kind of unleashed.
Yeah, where he had 7 tackles. I think he had a big forced fumble, a couple tackles for loss. He was really unleashed in that game. Texas dominated that game. That was the game that helped them solidify their spot in the college football playoff with how they looked the last 2 weeks of the season. And Anthony Hill has talked about this. PK has talked about this. Even Sark has kind of mentioned this. As a freshman, Anthony Hill wasn't doing things right, but he was going to do them fast. If he wasn't going to do things right schematically, as he was still kind of learning the system, he was always going to do it fast. And that's what we saw. He's that kind of specimen. This year, I'm looking for him to really take that next step from a mental standpoint. I think the game's going to slow down for him a lot. But he's got to be the guy now because he doesn't have a veteran he has David Benda, but he doesn't have an All-American kind of guy to rely upon in Jalen Ford next to him. So I'm interested to see what Anthony Hill can provide, but I do think Colin Simmons eventually will work his way into that rotation big time. He's just way too talented. And I think he could be similar this year to Anthony Hill. Maybe he's not perfect, but everything that guy does is going to be 110% just all out. And that's what Texas could use in their edge room, as we've seen them not really get the most production out of that room in years past. And they're going to need it because of the questions like we talked about on the interior. So any other comments on the depth chart before we transition?
On the Colin Simmons thing, my theory on it is, I mean, we go into the big house week 2 of the season. And my opinion on that really is just like, I think they want to lean on their veterans early, from a defensive line standpoint, just because you got to be locked in onto your run fits here in this early part of the season, because we play Michigan week 2, and then we play Georgia. What is it, week 4 or 5?
Yep.
Right.
I think it's week 7. Week 7 or 8.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, and obviously in the SEC also, on top of that, it's just like Kentucky, Florida, all those teams that want to run the football. I mean,
Yep.
I think that's probably why they want to lean on their veterans a little more. And I think putting Trey Moore with the ones and kind of getting a feel for what he can actually do, and making sure he's acclimated with the system as much as possible, I think is a huge priority.
Yeah. The depth chart stuff will be something we talk about fall camp, new developments at every single position. Anything else we need to mention? Let's see here. I guess everything else we kind of need to mention will be with the offensive line, which we're going to talk about now, as we transition into our next segment.
Well, I would want to ask you one thing before we move
Okay.
on. In terms of the defense, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, but if you were to name 2 or 3 players that you see as being extremely important and can't get hurt if Texas wants to get to where they want to go, who are the guys that pop into your mind from that standpoint?
Okay. So number 1, absolutely cannot get hurt for an extended period of time.
Right.
Is Anthony Hill.
I agree with that.
There's just too much young, inexperienced depth. Not to say they aren't talented. They're very talented. Too much inexperienced depth behind Anthony Hill. They don't have another guy like Anthony Hill on this defense. So he would be number 1. Number 2, I think it would be Manny Muhammad. He's got to stay healthy, because he's going to be relied upon to be, fair or not, their number 1 corner. And then Alfred Collins needs to stay healthy, because even though we think we've got solid football players in these transfers that they brought in, Vernon Broughton's still kind of an unknown.
Right.
And you just don't want to lose your most athletic, tantalizing, intimidating athlete on the defensive line. He can't get hurt. Those would be the 3 names come to mind for me. But of course you want good health. But would you agree with those 3 names? Do you want to mention anybody else?
I would definitely agree with that. I think I would even put actually, no. I think I agree with your order. I was going to say maybe putting Collins ahead of Muhammad, but I do think having that strength at number 1 corner to shadow the best weapon on the other side is just really, really important, especially given how much struggles Texas had in the secondary last year. And then Collins, I'll say this before we move on too, is just I think he's really the only guy that has shown like legit, like high level NFL level pass rush
Mm-hmm.
from an interior standpoint. And that's too important to lose because you create numbers advantages, you create problems when you blitz if you have a legit interior pass rusher, especially when you have the edge rushers that we have now.
Yeah, I think the spots you don't worry about on defense are edge. If Baron Sorrell got hurt, you just throw in Ethan Burke, right? If Trey Moore gets hurt, even though you don't love playing a freshman, it's Colin Simmons. You still have Justice Finkley. And then you can even throw Colton Vasek, who's emerging. From that 2023 class, he was a super blue chip from Westlake High School, just like Ethan Burke was. He can be thrown in there. Like the edge position, there's just too much really solid depth at that position. I don't think you worry really about nickel corner because of Jade Barron's versatility. If you throw Jalen Gilbo in there and things don't go well, or he gets hurt, you can throw Jelani McDonald, who has good length in there, or you can move Jade Barron, who's used to the position, back to that position. I think the worry spots are, and I don't even worry about corner all that much. I mean, I worry a little bit about Manny Muhammad getting hurt. But on the other side, you have Javion Cole, who's experienced, has played years of college football. You have Gavin Holmes, who's a veteran. You have guys who have game experience on that side. You could even throw Jade Barron at outside corner. Not that I don't love Kobe Black, but playing a true freshman against the Oklahoma wide receivers in a big game, or Georgia's wide receivers in one of those high caliber games could,
or even on the road in Michigan.
Yeah, pose issues for you. Offensively, obviously there's probably not a whole lot you worry about. I mean, the real guy you want to keep healthy is Quinn Ewers. Even though we do like Texas's quarterback depth. But it's an interesting conversation, and we'll get even more into the weeds in future episodes. So, kind of for the second half of the show, let's talk offensive line. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah.
And by the way, I don't know what you may have heard, but I didn't really hear much on the quarterbacks yet. I didn't hear much
either.
on Quinn Ewers. I didn't hear much on Arch Manning. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. We'll have to see how that situation plays out. But I did hear some interesting stuff on the offensive line. So let me throw up this graphic so that you guys can see the not the depth chart, but the list of offensive linemen here for Texas. And as you look at this, I'll go ahead and lay out how it's been going down in fall practice. I'm just going to take off the lower third so you can try to see the full list. Okay, that should be good. So the starting offensive line, to no surprise, was from left to right, Kelvin Banks, Hayden Connor, Jake Majors at the center, DJ Campbell, and then Cam Williams. Your second offensive line, the backup offensive line, if you want to call it that, was from left to right, Trevor Gooseby, who we've heard a ton of good things about. Right. You see, he's a monster, 6'7", 315.
Jeez.
Just a specimen of a human being. Cole Hudson, who has a lot of experience. He's kind of the backup swing guard, if you will. Connor Robertson, Neto Umeozulu, and Andre Kojo. And then your third offensive line group was a lot of the younger guys. Daniel Cruz, the freshman, was working at third team center. Brandon Baker, the 5-star offensive lineman freshman, was working at third team right tackle. Malik Ogbo was working at third team left tackle. We don't need to go much further than that. Where do you want to start this offensive line discussion? Does anything come to mind for you? Do any players come to mind for you?
For me, it comes down to the right side of the offensive line. I think that's where the conversation starts. I'm honestly really excited about that side of the offensive line in particular because we know how good the left side is. That's already a given with Kelvin Banks and those guys. But on the right side, you have 700 pounds between your right guard and your right tackle.
Yeah.
Between those two guys, I'm really looking for Texas to just kind of impose their will on some teams this year. Like, I don't want to throw this word around, but I think of the word dominant and like little things like that. Just being able to be like, you know what we're going to run and you can't stop it. Like, I want that. I think of certain points last year where, and obviously we had a really good offensive line last year. Like, I'm not saying we didn't, but I think of certain points like the Oklahoma game where we had where we got stopped at the goal line and that changed the flow of that game. Little moments throughout a season like that. I think this year the expectation should be, even against a Georgia, even against the top teams, we've got to be able to impose our will at certain points in the game. And I'm not saying that has to be a every down thing. We have to just like blow people off the ball. But when the chips are down, this is a group that has to be able to get it done if we want to win a national championship.
You mentioned those moments. There were the really good moments where Texas looked like the best offensive line in America. Up there with the elite of the elite. Michigan and Washington were, I think, in my mind, the two best offensive lines in the country last year. And those two teams played in the national championship game. It's really important to have a good offensive line. The question that you see in the title of this live stream that I kind of wanted to be the focus of this segment was, can Texas win the Joe Moore Award? Can they be the best offensive line in the country this year? Why do I want to have this conversation? Well, the two best offensive lines in the country last year, gone. Just Washington's roster, let's be honest, just kind of decimated because all the draft picks that they had, their coach left, guys entered the portal. They're going to have kind of a restructured offensive line. And they were the best offensive line in the country, or at least they were voted that, and probably deserved it for the way that they allowed Michael Penix to thrive in that offense. And then you had Michigan, right? I mean, we know about Michigan's offensive line. No need to, say much more. But they had won the Joe Moore Award, I think, the previous 2 years. And then you have other really good offensive lines that we don't need to go on and on about. But Texas, I would put in that next tier last year. And the only guy they lost was
Christian Jones.
The only problem with Texas last year on the offensive line was there were just, I think, some lapses, some moments of inconsistency where, for whatever reasons, they weren't, or it didn't seem like they were at 100%, 110% intensity, like, let's go kick your ass. They're going to need that week to week in the SEC. And I think where the conversation starts with me is also the right side, but in particular, Cam Williams at right tackle. here's a guy who has cut 25 to 30 pounds from what I'm hearing from the spring until now, the fall. The issue with him has always been he's just a massive human being. And it's about how he carries his weight. He's huge. He's probably one of the bigger offensive linemen. As you mentioned, like him next to DJ Campbell, that's got to be one of the bigger guard tackle combos in the entire country. If you just look at the heights and weights of those two guys, I think based on what I heard, and listen, I mean it's shells, it's like pads, helmets, and shorts. They haven't gone full pads yet, but just based on what people have watched over the course of the first couple of days of practice, they can see the potential for Cam Williams to be a high draft pick after this year. Just 1 year of starting experience at the college level, which, to be fair, could worry some scouts. But we've seen guys do it before. We saw Amarius Mims, right, do it this past year, correct? There have been other guys, other examples that you could probably mention. But I think he's the big X factor here. You had a lot of experience you have to replace. Of course, replacing Christian Jones. But I think Cam Williams, who's noticeably gigantic with his athleticism, as long as he stays healthy, is going to be and hopefully develop into one of those guys. He showed flashes of brilliance as a run blocker. I think that's really where you'll see him thrive, just his size and strength. But cutting down his weight, because one of the problems with him, last year when he did get into the game was just getting tired, fatigue, and that's not a good thing when you're going up against these SEC edge rushers. And these top tier teams have the ability to rotate in elite NFL kind of guys at that edge rush position the entire game. And in pass protection, that's where it hurt Cam Williams. I think cutting down his weight, getting in better shape, however he's done that, and then having Kyle Flood, who I do trust, refine his technique in pass rush situations, will be big for him. If he can be, I don't even want to say like all SEC third team right tackle, but if he could be like just a solid right tackle, maybe even be like all SEC honorable mention, have a really good season, have people talking about him as a potential draft pick at the end of the season, that would be a massive success. Because everywhere else, I don't really have questions. I don't have questions about Kelvin Banks. I don't have questions about Jake Majors at center. That I kind of consider those two guys as kind of like the brain trust of this offensive line. They've started the most games. They have the most experience. They've proven the most out of the current five. Then you have Hayden Connor, who started the past 2 years and has been really solid and keeps on improving. It's really the right side where the conversation needs to happen. I think DJ Campbell will take that next step. It's really, to me, possibly one of the whole X factors of this offense is Cam Williams at right tackle. So if he can do that, yes, there is a strong possibility, given the returning experience, the depth that Texas has, the talent that they have, that if they give that intensity that we saw at the end of the Alabama game, or the intensity that we saw in the Oklahoma State game, where they were just kicking their ass in the run game. They can be the Joe Moore Award winning offensive line, in my opinion. And that should basically, I think if they have that kind of season on the offensive line, you can expect them to be right back around where they were last year, possibly playing in a quarterfinal or national semifinal because of the talent that they have. So I don't know if you agree with that, but because it, of course, will depend on who they play and where they play them. But that should be the kind of season that they have if this offensive line lives up to its potential.
Definitely.
Anything else on the offensive line you are interested in or you want to ask me?
Well, I think anything I ask you will just ultimately be decided on the field. So
Right.
I think for now that's a good stopping point for the offensive line conversation. Did you still want to get to the Big Ten stuff tonight?
We're going to try to do a little bit of that. But before we do that, I actually want to ask you a question.
Okay.
You're a draft geek. So am I, but you
Yeah.
are too. Where do you you may have not studied the entire draft class at tackle next year, but I know there are a couple guys near the top, as there always are. Where do you I guess, project Kelvin Banks? Like, how high can Kelvin Banks rise? Is he do you see him more of like a top half of the draft, like a top 15 pick guarantee? Do you think he can rise and have that kind of season? What will he have to do to maybe even be like a top 5 pick? Do you think he can do that?
Yeah,
What are
I
your
think he definitely
expectations for
can.
him?
I mean, the great thing about Banks is he's going to have more snaps under his belt against just about any tackle you put him up against in terms of comparison. More experience, and from his time as a true freshman to now, I think he's given up like a pressure on 2.5%
Yep.
of dropbacks,
Mm-hmm.
which is I think first or second in the country.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean, there's no real answer for you other than just, I guess, doing it again one more season. And I think maybe the run blocking maybe has
Mm-hmm.
one more step to go, maybe in terms
Yeah.
of being like a top 5 pick.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, with how good of a pass protector he already is and how much experience he already has, and the fact that he's demonstrated an ability to stay healthy, knock on wood, I think all of that, would put him as a top 10 pick in my eyes. I think he's going to be the first or second tackle off the board.
Here's my little Kelvin Banks take. 27 starts in his career so far. His freshman season, and then last year. Last year, he was a first team All Big 12 selection, and a second team All American selection. And one of the hardest things to do in college football is start as a freshman at left tackle. And he did that. And not only did he do it, but he was already halfway into his freshman season considered one of the best tackles in America.
Yeah.
And then he only kind of kept improving last year. He had I think he had more rough patches last year than he did his freshman season, but I mean, can't expect the guy to be perfect. Nobody's perfect. But you mentioned the stat I wanted to mention, which is over 1,840 career snaps at left tackle. He's allowed a pressure on 2.2% of those dropbacks. That's incredible. And he's acquitted himself well against some of the best edge rushers we've seen in college football, high draft picks. He's gone against 4 first-round draft picks at the edge position the past couple of years. He's gone against Will Anderson. He's gone against Tyree Wilson from Texas Tech. He's gone against Will McDonald from Iowa State, who I think went to the Jets. And then he's gone against
Will Anderson.
Tyree Wilson. And then there's a guy from K-State who he also went up against, Felix Uzama.
Oh, come on.
I don't know how to say his full
Karamoa
name.
or something like that.
Yeah.
From the Chiefs. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Those 4 edge guys were first-round NFL draft picks, and Kelvin Banks has gone up against those kinds of guys, and he's going to go up against more this upcoming season. But the fact that he turned himself into the most impressive true freshman offensive tackle in possibly Longhorn history, and was a freshman All-American, was a second-team All-American last year. I think he's going to be. I expect him to be, if he remains healthy, first-team All-SEC. Have that kind of season and elevate himself into top 10 discussions. I won't go top 5 yet, but top 10 sounds like where he could fit in. And he's still getting better, which is scary.
Yeah.
Still has the opportunity to improve. So here's one last stat for you guys. From week 8 on last year, Kelvin Banks was the highest graded pass blocking offensive tackle in college football per Pro Football Focus. So he finished the season really strong last year, and that kind of coincided with the run Texas made to the college football playoff after losing to Oklahoma. So anything else on the offensive line before we try to get to some Big Ten discussions?
No, I think that's it, man.
Okay. And thank you to our audience who's watching it. It's late on the East Coast, 11:50 p.m., 10:50 Central. So thank you guys for watching. Greatly appreciate that. A lot of Longhorn talk coming. Don't worry. And real quick, it's the month of August. And so not only do we have fall camp going on, not only will we be talking about the upcoming season, all these teams, and the Longhorn depth chart, and this and that, but it's a big month for recruiting decisions as well. I'm trying to get this graphic off the screen. There we go. Maybe. Yes.
Yeah.
Big month for recruiting as well. Texas, you're going to see Khalil Lockett make a decision this upcoming Wednesday. You're going to see Michael Fasusi. I think it's the 21st is when he's going to announce. You're going to see Jamie French announce at the very end of this month. I think it's August 30th, like the day before the season starts or something like that. And then you could see some other big-time targets like Michael Terry and, Jonah Williams, who Texas has jumped back in the race with. Big-time recruiting month. So as those decisions start to come in, we'll be talking about that. So if you're one of those guys like me who misses those kinds of discussions, they're coming. But for now, we're going to be more football focused. And then eventually this month, I don't know when it will be, when we can get a break from football, because we also have all of our NFL stuff that we got to catch up on. By the way, Hall of Fame game last night. I have a question for you about that in a minute. We're going to have an episode where we run through all the additions, all the subtractions, and the current roster for Texas baseball going into fall ball, which starts here pretty soon. With the new coaching staff, all the transfers they brought in, guys that they got back from the MLB draft, guys that went to the MLB draft, everything else. We'll be talking about that eventually. But probably a couple weeks from now is when that discussion will take place. First of all, how much did you watch of the Hall of Fame game? And then number two, what do you think of the new kickoff?
I watched the first quarter of it.
Okay.
I was taking off my stepmom because I was switching between gymnastics and football. And she was like, "Why are you watching football?" Blah, blah, blah. But I think the new kickoff rules, man. I think it's a positive change, but it's gonna take some getting used to. Like my brain hurts. like I'm just looking at the screen like, what the fuck is this? Like, it's definitely it's going to be cool to see the evolution of like scheming in real time for something like this, because for us, like being like young football fans, like in our 20s, a lot of the concepts we see in terms of offensive football and defensive football, they've been around for probably twice our age, 40 years, 50 years. So for something like this, it's just all getting thought up in real time, which is going to be really sick, honestly.
Yeah, I had a similar take to you. I only watched really the first quarter. By the way, shout out to former Longhorns, Roshan Johnson for the
Yeah,
Bears
looked good, man.
and Colin Johnson. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? But congratulations to Colin Johnson, who I think scored twice last night.
Yeah.
He had a big game. And then, we're not going to dive into the depths of the Hall of Fame game, but I did think Davis Mills looked pretty good for Houston. Honestly, I just want to kind of ask you, and before that, let me give my kickoff take. It's going to take some getting used to. I think someone, I can't remember who it was. I think it was either Aikman or Buck on the broadcast said it's kind of like an extended running play. Like that's kind of what it looks like. It's just kind of a bigger running play. I think my take was I think it's gonna make people care a lot more about special teams. As I think it's gonna encourage more kickoff returns, obviously, which I think was the point of it.
Yeah.
Make the game a little bit safer, which also was a goal of, having them line up 5 yards apart and nobody can move until, someone touches the ball instead of the guys running full speed downhill. Hopefully there's less injuries. My question, though, is as congested as it is, how many kickoff returns for touchdowns are we going to see? I'll be interested to hear, because I don't know the statistics, but will kickoff returns for touchdowns go up this season or will they potentially go down? That'll be interesting. But it feels like having to return those kickoffs, games could swing one. That's another way games could swing one way or the other if, ball security becomes an issue on those plays. Or field position gets flipped really fast with the big return. It'll be interesting. I don't think college football is doing it, but it'll be interesting to see what happens in the NFL. And then my other question was, since we haven't talked in a little over a week, what sports in the Olympics have you been watching mainly?
Oh, yeah. I've been watching a lot of the golf.
Okay.
That's been really good so far. And
Absolutely.
it's kind of got like a major feel since you get a lot of the top guys from Live playing in it too. But what else? I've been watching beach volleyball a bit here and there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's been a mix of everything, just like gymnastics, swimming.
Yep.
I'm watching pretty much whatever's on, unless it's like equestrian or something. I'm not watching
Mhm.
equestrian. Sorry, equestrian people, but
Um,
not for me.
I've been watching a lot of swimming. I really enjoy the swimming. Um, Lots of gymnastics, and by the way, I mean, holy cow, the strength and the coordination and just like the overall
Yeah,
athlete you have to be to pull off the stunts that they do in the gymnastics. I mean, where does Simone Biles rank in like just if we're ranking athletes in the world right now? I mean, she's got to be up there. It's one of the best female athletes I've ever seen.
yeah. I mean, in
Her
terms of just
ability
like
to do
athleticism, I
things that
mean,
she does. Um, Gymnastics has been fun. Beach volleyball, of course, um, especially on the women's side, has been fun to watch.
yeah. Oh, team handball. I've been watching a bit of that
Mhm.
actually. That
Yeah, I
that
haven't
sport
watched
is pretty
handball.
sick, honestly. I like that sport a lot.
I watched some track and field tonight. That just started, and then of course
Yeah.
I've seen a little bit of basketball. I've seen the USA play. It's been a big discussion here back in the States. Uh, Going back to close calls against South Sudan and who else
Yeah.
did they play? I can't even remember.
Germany,
Germany. Um,
Serbia.
and then I've obviously watched a little bit of France, see what Wimby's doing out there.
Yeah.
And then I actually watched some of the 3-on-3 basketball this afternoon.
Yeah, that is so strange to me how they don't really have NBA players in it at
Yeah.
all.
They have Jimmer Fredette for what it's worth.
Yeah, I know. Like that is
He wasn't even
Jimmer
playing
Fredette
today.
sighting in 2024 is crazy.
He wasn't even playing today against China because I think he hurt himself.
Oh.
Um, it's not great quality of
I
basketball. I
mean,
don't
what? I mean,
recommend.
he's got to be in his 30s now. Like,
Yeah, I don't recommend it. If you want to
yeah, and I
watch,
mean, I'm seeing dudes like smoke layups and like just like turn the ball over. Like it's so strange. I don't understand it.
and I'm trying to think of anything else that I've watched. But I think the Olympics overall. I mean, how long has it been? A week?
Yeah, it's been a week.
So we have what, another week or so?
Yeah.
I don't know how long the Olympics last, but it's been fun to just have on in the background while you're, I don't know,
Doing
relaxing or
whatever.
doing
Yeah.
whatever. And it'll kind of carry us into like the bulk of preseason for what it's worth. Like I think,
Yeah. There'll be something to watch until preseason
yeah.
actually starts.
Uh, okay. Well, it's kind of late here on the East Coast. It's past midnight, but as far as I don't really want to dive too deep into the Big Ten because I feel like this kind of discussion will be more entertaining
Yeah.
for.
Let's just touch on like three big storylines that come to mind, I guess.
Okay.
To me, the first one that pops into my head is Oregon going into the Big Ten. Um,
Absolutely.
I think it's an interesting dynamic just because if Oregon comes into the Big Ten and then wins the Big Ten in the first year, it's like it's gonna be a weird feeling for the Big Ten. It's just like, oh, this Pac-12 school just popped in and stole our lunch money. Like, um, but yeah, I think Oregon's got as good a chance as any to win the Big Ten, just because it's I don't know everything Dan Lanning is doing just intrigues me. I don't know.
I think Josh Pate does this segment. He does the biggest what ifs in college football. And he's been doing it for like a month plus on every one of his shows.
Yeah.
He just asks what if questions. What if this happens? What if this happens? think one of the questions was something like, what if, new conference members win the Big 12, the SEC, and the Big 10? Like, what if you have all new conference members win every one of those conferences? And I think in his recent college football playoff predictions, he had Ohio State winning the Big 10, but he had Texas winning the SEC, and I can't remember who he had winning the Big 12. But I mean, it's interesting to think about.
I think he had
And,
Oklahoma State.
yeah, and he certainly, with Oregon, the way that they've really just flipped the switch when it comes to the way that they're approaching NIL,
Yeah.
the way they're acquiring talent at, to look like a national championship contender on the offensive and defensive lines, to have the necessary depth that you need to compete with Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, the elite of the elites in college football. What they're doing in the portal, what they've done in the portal is second to none. Going out and getting Jamari Caldwell, who was a interior defensive line target from University of Houston that Texas was targeting, to steal Jabbar Muhammad from the grasp of Texas, from Washington. It's huge for them. They go and get not one, but two quarterbacks in the portal. One for right now, Dylan Gabriel, and one for the future in Dante Moore, who was a 5-star. They have a lot of returning talent. Dan Lanning has made Oregon kind of into not quite the talent acquiring factory that is Georgia, because nobody's really Georgia other than maybe Alabama. But they're right there with Texas in recruiting, the way that they're acquiring super blue chip kind of talents. And Dan Lanning, to be honest with you, is one of my favorite. Like, if you were to ask me who are your top 3 favorite coaches in college football, I think he might be in my top 3.
Yeah, and I think he's quickly becoming like a face of college football.
Yeah.
Especially with Nick Saban and Jim Harbaugh leaving the sport as well. My big question for Oregon, the thing that has kind of popped in my head is like, how good is Dylan Gabriel going to be in cold weather? Because I kind of see him as kind of like he's a little bit of a smaller quarterback. His velocity isn't bad, but we've never really seen him play in cold weather, so that just makes it a question mark in my head.
My other questions in the Big Ten, of course, one of the big ones is, how does Michigan replace everything it's lost?
Yeah.
In the draft from that national championship winning team last year. And the biggest question is, who's throwing the football for them? Do they have a capable starter at quarterback who can throw completions in a high-level early season game against Texas? Who's not going to be kind of a deer in the headlights, like, not that Jalen Milroe was awful in the Texas game, but he made mistakes.
Yeah.
If you make mistakes against the explosive offense that is Texas, you give them good field position, you're likely not winning that game. Because you're just giving them too many chances. As good as your defense is, if you give Texas's offense enough chances, if you give Sark enough chances, and if they get any little teensy bit better in the red zone, you're likely going to lose. A veteran kicker.
Yeah. And Michigan has never really been the team that's built to come back from 2 touchdowns down.
Exactly. So that's the big question. Is like that offensive line, you lose all five starters in the quarterback position. Huge question for Michigan. But you replace Jim Harbaugh internally with Sharon Moore, you retain a lot of the skeleton of the roster, despite, losing the bulk of your production offensively. You still have Colston Loveland at the tight end position. You still have Donovan Edwards, who could be an All-American running back. We've seen him really burst onto the scene behind Blake Corum the past couple of years.
Definitely.
And the way that Michigan develops offensive lines, you really can't doubt that at this point. The only question really is quarterback. Now, will this year's offensive line be in the running for the Joe Moore Award? I don't know about that. Maybe. I mean, would I 100% doubt it? No, it's Michigan. But is it likely? It's hard to say at this point because we just don't really know how that's going to shake out. But the quarterback with Alex Orji or whoever it might be is the real question for me. We know they're going to rely on their run game with Edwards. We know they have maybe the best tight end in America in Colston Loveland. We don't know 100%, but he's going to be a high draft pick next year if he doesn't get hurt. And we know their defense is going to be tops in the nation.
Yeah.
They return Will Johnson. They return the bulk of that defensive line, especially on the interior. Mason Graham's coming back. Kenneth Grant's coming back. They lose a couple linebackers. They lose, Mike Sainer still in the secondary, some veteran, grizzled guys who have played in those kinds of games. But I still expect their defense to be top notch.
Definitely.
Maybe I'd say top 10, but maybe even top 5. That's the real questions. Because if they can figure out
I would say the question for me about their defense is more so their new defensive coordinator, because
Right.
Jim Harbaugh brought his guy with him.
Exactly. But if they can figure out the quarterback, that's not a team you want to mess with.
Yeah. Here's my theory on Michigan, though. Like, I just kind of think for their style of football that they want to play, I think an experienced team is kind of a requirement for them to play the style that they want to play. And what I mean by that is, like last year, Joel Klatt described their style of play as kind of like a boa constrictor, like squeezing the life out of their opponent by limiting possessions and just running the football down their throat, limiting mistakes, waiting for their opponent to make the mistakes. Those are the types of things that a experienced football team can just do better than a team that's not.
Yeah.
So, like, my point is, like, to the point of, like, them not being able to come back from 2 touchdowns down. Like, their margin of error is different than a team like, I don't know, LSU, I guess, where they can put up 40 points and make up for a tough defensive performance or something like that. So I do think they're still going to be a really good team, but I also, until we see who their quarterback is and how he is, I don't see them as on the same tier as a Ohio State or Oregon right now.
I don't either. The other storyline I do want to mention and talk about is how high can Penn State climb?
Yeah.
With the elimination, and this has been a question for years now, but with the elimination of divisions, they're no longer kind of that third rung behind Michigan and Ohio State. And what was it, the Big Ten East or West? I don't even.
East, yeah.
Big Ten East. Now it's just the 2 best teams get to the Big Ten championship game, regardless of who it is. Same in the SEC, of course. But if I'm not mistaken, they avoid they do have to play Ohio State, but they avoid Michigan. And I think they avoid Oregon. Yeah, they avoid Oregon and Michigan this year. They only have to play Ohio State. And I think that's a home game, I believe. Yes, it is. And then you get USC. They do have to travel to USC,
Ooh,
but
it's a long
we
trip.
we talked about USC. I do think Penn State's going to be a better football team
Yeah.
than USC is going to be. And then, I mean, other than opening up on the road in Morgantown against West Virginia, which could be a tricky environment, and maybe going to USC or playing at Wisconsin, like Penn State should beat Washington this year. They just should. They have a
Yeah.
more experienced quarterback. It's a new coaching staff. It's a basically an entirely new roster. They should beat Illinois. They should beat Purdue. They should beat Minnesota. These are the teams they've been beating over and over the past couple of years. The problem has been they can't beat Ohio State. They can't beat Michigan. Now that they avoid Michigan and they don't have to play Oregon, who both of us think could win the Big Ten, how high can they go? Can they be in the Big Ten championship game? That's a big question, I think, in the college football season this year. Is Penn State? They're kind of like an X factor, I think, in the playoff race. Because if I think it's generally thought that Oregon and Ohio State, however it plays out, are going to be in the playoff. You would think that the Big Ten would at least get 3 teams in. Can Penn State be that team? That's the big question.
Yeah, I think I think they can get to the Big Ten championship game for sure. I think here's the question for me. I think it's going to be more so about who is Drew Aller throwing to, and who's going to step up in that room. Last season, I'm pulling it up right here. They finished with the 73rd team receiving grade according to the PFF,
Not good.
which not good at all. And I think also their defense has been good for years, but can their defense be great? I think is an interesting question. Um, that that always is a interesting part about Penn State is like they seem like they're just knocking on the door, knocking on the door, knocking on the door, but you look at it and then they end up playing Ohio State and Michigan and they get exposed. Like last year, they got exposed on offense. They they couldn't really put up points against those teams. So this year, I think at the very least, you got to be competitive against Ohio State. Like you got to give them a game at the very least. And what did we say last year too? We said they were a year away. They had a young first year quarterback. So now that crutch is kind of lifted, and now it's just like you gotta win.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta do something.
I don't worry about their defense. Their defense, I think, is going to be a top 20-ish defense in college football. They've been that kind of defense the past couple of years. That defense, even when their offense has just been, let's be honest, hard to watch at times in the biggest games.
Yeah.
Their defense has kind of kept them in those games. Like those games still haven't been blowouts. The exciting part for me, and yes, Drew Aller has to get better, and they got to create more explosive plays down the field. Whoever emerges in the wide receiver room will be whoever emerges. And I can't remember exactly off the top of my head who they brought in the portal, but I do think they brought in a couple guys through the portal.
Yeah, they brought in
Wide
a kid
receiver.
from K-State, I believe. Cephas.
Yeah, Dante Cephas.
Yeah, right.
What I wanted to mention, though, is the change at OC. How much can Andy Kotelnicki, I think it's how you say his name, who they hired from Kansas. He was he spent 11 seasons with Lance Leipold. at 3 different spots. 3 years with Leipold at Kansas, and he's been. I mean, you've seen how much that Kansas offense has improved, regardless of the quarterback they've had in there. Jalen Daniels was hurt last year, but when they've had Jalen Daniels in there, they've been a pretty explosive, good offense. Last year they were ranked 8th in rushing yards, 211 per game at Kansas. I'm interested to see what wrinkles, because the whole Mike Yurcich experiment didn't really work, clearly.
Yeah.
What wrinkles can Kotelnicki bring from Kansas to Penn State? Because that's really what they need to do. They need more explosive plays in their offense. And I think what Kotelnicki will bring, he's been an offensive coordinator and play caller for 18 seasons. He's got a ton of experience.
Yeah.
I think he's going to bring a more creative approach to their offense. The Penn State offense is a really interesting case because it really wasn't a problem in most of their games. They averaged almost 42 points per game and 10 regular season wins. But in their losses to those teams that we always talk about, Ohio State and Michigan, 13.5 points per game. Just not going to do it.
And it was
ugly. Not going to do it in today's age of college football. So it's really, when you play Ohio State, how good can your offense be? That's really what the question is for Penn State in my eyes. They're typically really good, not elite, but really good on both lines of scrimmages. They typically develop really good tight ends. They're really solid running the football. They always have been. They're plenty good enough defensively. You wouldn't call them elite, but they're good enough to win. How can those guys connect? Drew Aller and the OC. Like, what wrinkles can they unlock in the offense? Penn State's really interesting this year. I'm excited to watch what they look like.
Yeah, to me, it's just run the ever-living shit out of the football. I mean, you have Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. That's probably one of the best running back rooms in America. So I think you just got to lean on that more, and then use the play action off of that. I think Drew Aller will benefit from it, if anything. And honestly, I'll go ahead and put this hot take out into the ether. If I were to pick any running back that could win the Heisman this year, Nicholas Singleton is probably on a very, very short list. He might even be my pick just because I think he's so dynamic. And I think he hasn't even been tapped into in the pass game just yet. I think he's versatile in that way.
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. Trying to think, what else do I want to mention here before we wrap this thing up?
What's your take on Nebraska?
Ooh. Look, here's the thing, man. Say what you want to say about Matt Rule, but his track record in coaching college football is he typically takes a big step year one to year two.
Yep.
And I think he has the requisite talent at the quarterback position now, even though he's a freshman. But he's got the talent, top tier talent at the quarterback position. The real difference could be difference maker at the quarterback position to elevate Nebraska to the next level. I don't view Nebraska until I see it on the field as, and I won't view them as, definitely not tier one. We know what tier one generally is considered. It's Oregon and Ohio State. And generally, Tier 2s, Penn State, Michigan. I mean, who else you want to throw in there? Maybe USC, maybe.
Yeah.
I kind of right now would put Nebraska with the way that they've kind of recruited so far under Matt Rule. They're doing a pretty good job there, and they're doing a decent job in the portal. But based on Rule's track record, I put Nebraska in Tier 3, and I think they're kind of a sleeper that could, when it's all said and done at the end of this season, could be kind of a Tier 2 Big Ten program. I don't know that it's going to take a couple years to maybe get into Tier 1. I don't know if that happens ever, but they have the NIL. Their NIL is very underrated. You just wouldn't know it. And I think they have the quarterback to be – it's just all how did they develop Dylan Raiola? That's really, I think.
And can they win some tight games too?
Yeah.
I think
can they stop shooting themselves in the foot?
Yeah, that too. I think I see them kind of on the same tier as like Iowa. Like they're going to play tough defense, and if they can get like Josh Pate kind of said B level quarterback play, I would even say C plus quarterback play. They can win most of their games. I would say. Like I think just at a base level, just not turning the football over, little things like that. I kind of see them as like similar to what UCLA was last year with Dante Moore, a true freshman quarterback, a really good defense with Latu and all those guys. I kind of think they're going to be a team like that. That's frisky early on in the season and then kind of tails off.
Yeah, I would even go like this. I would put Oregon and Ohio State clearly in Tier 1. I would venture to say that Penn State, well, I think Michigan's probably at the top of Tier 2 based on the roster this year. If we're going what they've achieved the past 3 years, Michigan's obviously Tier 1 ahead of Oregon.
Yeah, in terms of like quality.
But based on this upcoming season, I think it's Ohio State, Oregon, Tier 1. I would venture to say that Penn State, Michigan, and I'd even group Iowa in there because Iowa's been in the Big Ten championship game year after year, even though their offense has been pretty bad, like one of the worst in college football.
Yeah.
They win games.
Yeah.
It's not pretty, but they've been there. They've done that. And look, if they get any kind of competent quarterback play that's above average, and their offense can be like top 50 in the country somehow.
Like I honestly think it's impressive, like
that
they were able to win as many games as they did, where their best offensive player was their freaking punter.
Yeah,
like holy crap!
But I put them in Tier 2, and then their Tier 3 is kind of like teams that could go either way. I mean, I could see USC being really good or being pretty terrible. I could see Nebraska doing kind of the same thing because they have a freshman quarterback. Like, it's just the way it goes in college football. To wrap up the episode, I actually wanted to pull up Nebraska's schedule to see what we think of Nebraska for this upcoming year because they do have a very interesting and I think doable schedule because if you look at it, I'll try to share my screen. And this is interesting conversation, by the way, that we're having. Let's see. Okay. So if I share my screen, can you see it somewhat? Maybe.
It's loading. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I can see that.
So you should beat UTEP. This is an interesting game. Colorado at Nebraska. It's going to be a primetime game, week 2. It won't get the attention it deserves because you have Texas, Michigan, but It's later in the day. It's after the Texas-Michigan game. I think that's a underrated week 2 game. One of the more underrated, what will be popular game of the season, Colorado and Nebraska. That's winnable, though. It's at home. You should beat Northern Iowa. They should beat Illinois. You should beat Purdue. You should beat Rutgers. Like, I think the first 7 games, I mean, I don't know if I should say they could be 7-0 because I don't know how much I still trust them to win the games that they're supposed to. But could they be 6-1 going into Ohio State? Like, it's not out of the question.
Yeah.
They get the kind of discipline football that they need. Because outside of Ohio State, like, well, going to Iowa will be tough at the end. Making the trip out to USC against that kind of offense could be tough. But you have the defense to beat these kinds of teams that aren't, even if they are explosive offensively, you have the defense to hold up. It's not out of the question that Nebraska wins 10 games this year if you look at their schedule. Because if they can be 6-1 going into Ohio State, and then, I mean, I could see them winning 9, maybe 10 on the high end. But anything less, in my opinion, than 8 wins on this schedule is a massive disappointment, massive failure.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think you can kind of view like Colorado as like a flip game, I guess. Like early on in the season against Shador Sanders at quarterback. That's a veteran quarterback at this point.
Yeah.
That's going to be a tough game. But outside of that, early on in the year, like you should definitely be leaving that Purdue game at least 4-1. Like that's I think the expectation.
Yeah. And then if they are like 5-2 or 6-1 going into the shoe, I want to see how they look against Ohio State. Like, if they can compete and stay close in that game for 2.5, 3 quarters, that would look really good for Nebraska. That would get some people really talking.
Definitely.
So yeah, that's Nebraska. Good conversation there. Anything else before we wrap things up tonight?
No, I think that's kind of it, man. This was a long episode, but it was well worth it. We had a lot to cover tonight, given that we haven't done an episode in quite a bit. But yeah, man, I think the Big Ten, man, there's so many freaking storylines. Obviously, the SEC does too, but I mean, we kind of already know who Kentucky is. We kind of already know what Florida is going to be. Like with the Big Ten, I feel like all of these kind of middle teams are kind of wild cards a little bit. Like I feel like Iowa could be frisky,
Right.
Nebraska could be frisky, even like Rutgers could give some problems here and there. So
yeah. So we're going to wrap things up, but before we do that, because I do actually need to go to bed here pretty soon.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a couple questions. For our next episode, our next Dit Hill, which will probably be middle of this upcoming week, I'd like to potentially do an episode of Dit Hill on this upcoming Wednesday, which is when Khalid Lockett makes his recruiting decision. Because I have a feeling that could be good news for us.
Yeah, we need it to be good news.
But we'll figure it out. It'll be sometime middle of the week. I do probably want to. I know we got to get to all of our SEC stuff, and you're dying to do that. But I do eventually want to talk a little bit more in depth about Oregon and Ohio State. We didn't really talk much about Ohio State tonight. But I do want to talk about those two teams more because I think those are the two teams that we really need to focus on.
Definitely.
Those are the teams we view in like tier 1 right now. Those are going to be probably preseason top 5 teams.
And I view them as being like top 8 seeds at least in
Yeah.
the playoff.
For our next position groups, though, because I had in mind, we've covered the offensive and defensive lines. I grouped quarterbacks and running backs together. I've grouped receivers and tight ends together. I've grouped edge and linebackers together. And then the secondary is a whole nother group. So we're going to do 4 dit holes here in the next 4 weeks before the season starts. So we have the requisite capacity to get to all the position groups. But in terms of the next position group we do, which one do you prefer to talk about next?
Ooh.
So it's quarterbacks, running backs, it's receivers, tight ends, it's edge, linebackers, and then it's secondary.
Running backs.
Quarterbacks and
for
running
sure.
back.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll be talking about Quinn Ewers, Arch Manning, and CJ Baxter, Jaden Blue, and everything in between on our next episode. All right. Well, for myself, Michael Wein, and for my co-host, Emmy Nixon, thank you for tuning in to this 90-minute edition of
Yep.
Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. Felt good to get back into the swing of things. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion on the first couple of days of fall camp. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion on the Texas offensive line. Answer in the comments, do you think Texas can win the Joe Moore Award this year for best offensive line in the country? And if not, who do you think is going to win it? And hopefully you enjoyed our open-ended Big Ten preview discussion on the biggest storylines in the new Big Ten with 18 teams. Pretty crazy.
18 teams is insane.
Saturday, August 3rd, ladies and gentlemen, we are now 4 weeks away from college football. But until Sunday or Monday night, when we get back into our NFL previews, I'm Michael Wein. He's Emmy Nixon. Hopefully you guys enjoyed tonight. Hook 'em horns and peace out.